What happens when a beloved television icon finds himself caught in a conversation that spirals completely out of control? When years of pent-up frustration about Hollywood politics and cancel culture finally explode on live television? That's exactly what unfolded when Christopher Meloni, the man who brought Detective Elliot Stabler to life for over a decade, walked off the Kelly Clarkson Show after one of the most intense confrontations ever captured on daytime TV. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and by the time security stepped in, the audience was audibly gasping. This wasn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong, it was a masterclass in how quickly things can unravel when two strong personalities clash over some of the most controversial topics in entertainment today. The show had been riding high on positive reviews, thanks to Kelly's warm and relatable interviewing style. Producers had booked Meloni to promote his return to the Law & Order franchise through organized crime, a topic that should have been safe territory for a seasoned actor. The interview began smoothly, with Kelly's trademark enthusiasm lighting up the room. "We're here with Christopher Meloni, and I have to tell you I'm such a huge fan of your work," she said brightly. "Law & Order SVU was appointment television in my house for years, and now you're back with organized crime. How does it feel to be stepping back into that world?" Christopher smiled, appearing relaxed. "It feels incredible, Kelly. Playing Elliot Stabler was such a defining part of my life for 12 years. When I left SVU, I thought that chapter was closed forever. But when Dick Wolf approached me about exploring who Stabler would be after all these years, I couldn't resist." Kelly leaned forward with genuine excitement. "The social media reaction when they announced your return was insane. Did you expect that level of excitement?" "The fan response has been overwhelming," Christopher replied, his calm demeanor beginning to show flashes of the intensity fans loved him for. "These characters matter to people. They see themselves in the fight for justice. It's not just entertainment, it's about something bigger." Kelly nodded. "That's what I love about procedural dramas. They tackle real issues, real problems that people face every day. And your character Stabler, he's always been that guy who fights for the victims, who doesn't back down from the hard fights." Christopher agreed. "Exactly. Stabler has always been about justice, about protecting people who can't protect themselves. He's not perfect, but his heart's in the right place. He's willing to cross lines that others won't to get to the truth." It was the perfect setup for Kelly to keep the conversation light, but instead, she shifted gears. "Speaking of crossing lines," she began carefully, "I have to ask you about something that's been making headlines. There's been a lot of discussion in Hollywood about accountability, about making sure entertainment reflects the values we want to see in society." Meloni's expression changed, a flicker of weariness crossing his face. "What do you mean specifically?" Kelly continued. "There's been some criticism about shows like Law & Order and how they portray law enforcement, especially with everything that's happened in recent years around police reform and social justice. Some people say these shows contribute to a problematic view of policing. What's your response to that?" For a moment, the room went quiet as Christopher processed the question. This wasn't the easy promotional conversation he'd expected. This was Kelly Clarkson, America's sweetheart, asking him to defend his life's work against accusations of social irresponsibility. "That's a complex issue," he replied carefully. "These shows have always tried to portray law enforcement in a nuanced way. We show good cops and bad cops. We show the system working and failing. The goal has always been to tell honest stories about the challenges facing both police and the communities they serve." But Kelly wasn't done. "Don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with portraying police officers as heroes week after week, especially when we know there are real issues: police brutality, systemic racism?" Christopher's jaw tightened. "Kelly, I think you're oversimplifying what these shows do. We've tackled police corruption. We've shown officers making terrible mistakes. We've explored trauma on both sides. These aren't propaganda pieces. They're stories about human beings trying to do difficult jobs in an imperfect system." Kelly, undeterred, leaned in slightly. "But at the end of the day, the cops are usually the good guys who save the day, right?" And that was the moment the tone of the interview shifted completely. As the discussion deepened, Kelly's tone grew sharper. "Some critics are saying that this kind of storytelling makes it harder for people to recognize the real problems in policing because they're used to seeing officers as heroic figures on television." The tension in the studio grew heavy, the once friendly energy evaporating into a dense silence. Christopher leaned back in his chair, his famous intensity now fully awakened. So what are you suggesting, Kelly? That we stop telling stories about people who dedicate their lives to protecting others? That we pretend there aren't men and women in law enforcement who genuinely care about justice? I'm not suggesting that at all, Kelly replied evenly, though her warmth had given way to a more assertive tone. I'm just asking whether you think there's a responsibility to be more critical, more aware of how these portrayals might affect the public's perception of policing. And I'm telling you that these shows have been critical. Christopher shot back, his voice rising slightly. We've never shied away from showing the dark side of law enforcement. But we've also shown that most cops are decent people doing a difficult job. Should we ignore that reality to satisfy some political agenda? The word political hung in the air like a spark to dry tinder. Kelly's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. I don't think wanting accountability in law enforcement is a political agenda, Christopher. It's about justice and equality. Christopher leaned forward, his voice sharp. And I think using entertainment as a weapon in political battles is dangerous. When you start demanding that art serve ideology instead of truth, you're walking down a very dark path. This was no longer an interview, it was a debate. The audience, expecting another lighthearted celebrity segment, sat frozen, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Kelly's eyes flashed with a kind of restrained fire. Christopher, I think you're misunderstanding me. Nobody's asking you to serve an ideology. We're asking you to be responsible about the impact your work has on society. Responsible? Christopher repeated, disbelief thick in his voice. Kelly, I've been responsible my entire career. I've portrayed complex characters, I've shown real issues. I've never glorified violence or corruption. And now you're telling me that showing dedicated police officers is somehow harmful to society? I'm not saying that, Kelly countered, her tone firm but controlled. What I'm saying is that in today's climate, we need to think more carefully about how we present law enforcement to the public. Maybe we need to show more of the problems, more of the systemic issues communities of color face. Christopher sat forward, his energy turning raw and unfiltered. You want to know what's irresponsible, Kelly? It's suggesting that storytellers should ignore half the truth to make a political point. Should we pretend there aren't cops who run toward danger while everyone else runs away? Should we ignore the officers who've dedicated their lives to protecting the vulnerable? Of course not, Kelly shot back. But we also can't pretend there isn't a serious problem with policing in this country. We can't ignore the voices of people who've been harmed by police violence. And we haven't ignored those voices, Christopher interrupted. Law and Order has tackled police brutality, racial profiling, corruption, cover-ups. We've shown the system failing people again and again. But we've also shown it working. Because sometimes it does work. Sometimes justice is served. Sometimes the good guys do win. And apparently, that's now considered problematic. The studio was silent. The audience sensed the gravity of what they were witnessing. Kelly's signature warmth had vanished, replaced by a cold determination. Christopher, I think you're being defensive about legitimate criticism, she said. When activists and community leaders say these shows contribute to a culture that makes it harder to hold police accountable, maybe we should listen to them instead of dismissing their concerns. I'm not dismissing anyone's concerns, Christopher said sharply. But I'm not going to apologize for spending my career telling stories about people who risk their lives every day. I'm not going to pretend all cops are villains just because it's fashionable right now. Nobody's asking you to pretend that, Kelly retorted, her own voice rising. But maybe you could acknowledge that the hero cop narrative has real-world consequences. Maybe you could admit that these shows shape how people trust the police even when they shouldn't. Christopher's face was flushed, his composure cracking. So now I'm responsible for how people think? For their political opinions? Kelly, I'm an actor. I tell stories. I don't indoctrinate people. But stories have power, Kelly pressed on. They shape how people see the world. And when you spend 20 years telling stories where the cops are always right and the system usually works, it affects how audiences see real-world policing. You know what shapes how people see policing? Christopher shot back. Real life. Crime victims. People who've been helped by good cops and hurt by bad ones. That's what shapes opinions, not television. That's incredibly naive, Kelly countered. The word landed like a punch. Christopher's expression darkened. You're telling me decades of TV shows portraying cops as heroes don't influence public opinion? she continued. You're telling me entertainment has no impact on how people see the world? I'm telling you, Christopher said, his voice now dangerously controlled, that I'm not going to take responsibility for society's problems. And I'm not going to be lectured by someone who built her career on feel-good entertainment about the supposed harm I've caused by portraying law enforcement officers as human beings. The personal jab hit hard. Kelly's expression turned icy. Excuse me? Feel-good entertainment? Christopher, I think you're forgetting where you are. This is my show and I'm asking reasonable questions about important issues. Reasonable questions? Christopher let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Kelly, you ambushed me. I came here to talk about my show, about my character, about returning to work I love. Instead, you've put me on trial for the crime of portraying police officers as human beings instead of monsters. Kelly's tone turned cold as she said, I didn't ambush you, Christopher. I asked about criticism your work has received. That's what journalists do, what interviewers do. If you can't handle discussing the impact of your work, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Her words carried a challenge that Christopher met instantly and fiercely. Don't lecture me about interviews, Kelly. I've been doing this longer than you've been in the business. I've faced real journalists asking real questions, not talk show hosts trying to score political points. Political points? Kelly shot back, her voice sharp. Caring about social justice isn't about scoring political points. It's about doing what's right, using the platform we have to make positive changes in the world. Christopher's expression hardened. And what makes you think that 20 years of law and order hasn't made positive changes? What makes you think showing people fighting for justice, standing up for victims, and refusing to give up on difficult cases hasn't inspired people to care more about these issues? Because the real world doesn't work like your TV show, Kelly replied bluntly. In the real world, cases don't get solved in an hour. The justice system fails people every day, and sometimes police officers are the problem, not the solution. Christopher stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. Kelly, I've worked with real cops, detectives, prosecutors. I've seen their dedication and their commitment to justice. I've watched them chase cases that haunted them for years, fighting for victims when everyone else gave up. And now you're telling me none of that matters because it doesn't fit your political narrative. It's not a political narrative, Kelly shot back. It's reality. Maybe if you spent less time in Hollywood and more time in the real world, you'd understand that. The insult hit like a slap. Christopher's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous tone. Less time in Hollywood? Kelly, I've spent my entire career telling honest stories about real issues. I've researched every role, worked with law enforcement, talked to victims. What have you done besides sing songs and host talk shows? Kelly's face went pale, then flushed red. How dare you minimize my career? I've used my platform to support causes I believe in, to shine light on important issues to help people who need help. By attacking the work of people who've dedicated their lives to the same causes. Christopher fired back. By tearing down stories that have inspired millions to care about justice? By asking hard questions about the impact of entertainment on society, Kelly replied firmly. By refusing to let celebrities hide behind their art when that art has real-world consequences. Christopher abruptly pushed back his chair, standing up so fast it rolled behind him. You know what, Kelly? I came here in good faith to talk about my work, to connect with fans who love these stories. Instead, you've turned this into a political inquisition where I'm supposed to apologize for my life's work. Sit down, Christopher, Kelly said, her voice faltering. We're not finished here. Oh, we're finished, he said flatly, his voice final. The studio fell silent. He stood tall, fists clenched at his sides. Kelly looked up at him, stunned that he was actually ending the interview. Christopher, please sit down, she pleaded, her tone now laced with uncertainty. We can discuss this like adults. We don't have to agree on everything. Adults? Christopher laughed bitterly. Adults don't ambush guests with political attacks disguised as interviews. Adults don't use their platforms to tear down others just to look enlightened. I wasn't attacking your life's work, Kelly protested, though her conviction wavered. I was asking legitimate questions about the impact of entertainment on society. That's what responsible interviewers do. Responsible interviewers? Christopher's voice rose. Responsible interviewers don't trap their guests. They don't pretend to be interested in someone's career just to lecture them about social justice. You brought me here under false pretenses. Kelly stood up too, facing him across the narrow space between their chairs. False pretenses? Christopher, these are important issues. These are conversations that need to happen. Just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean we shouldn't have them. I'm not uncomfortable with difficult conversations, Christopher shot back. I'm uncomfortable with dishonest ones. You didn't want a conversation, Kelly. You wanted to make a statement. You wanted to use me as a prop in your political theater. Political theater? Kelly's voice was rising now, almost shrill. Caring about social justice isn't political theater. Asking tough questions isn't political theater. Maybe you're just not used to being challenged. Not used to being challenged? Christopher stepped closer, his presence charged with anger. Kelly, I've been challenged by real journalists, real critics, real people who actually understand the work I do. I've never been challenged by someone who clearly did no research and has no idea what she's talking about. Kelly's face was flushed crimson, her composure slipping completely. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Every camera, every audience member frozen as two professionals' reputations and tempers collided in front of millions. Her carefully maintained composure was gone. Christopher, I understand perfectly well, Kelly snapped. I understand that you've spent your career making millions portraying a fantasy version of law enforcement that doesn't exist in the real world. Fantasy version? Christopher's tone was incredulous. Kelly, I've portrayed a man who's been traumatized by his job, who's made terrible mistakes, who's struggled with anger and violence. I've shown the cost of this work on families, relationships, and mental health. How is that fantasy? Because at the end of the day, your character is still the hero, Kelly shot back. At the end of the day, the system works, justice is served, and the good guys win. That's not reality for millions of people in this country. Christopher's patience snapped. And what would you have me do? Only tell stories where the system fails? Only show corruption and brutality? Should I ignore the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, justice is served? You should show the whole truth, Kelly insisted, her voice firm. Not just the parts that make law enforcement look good. I have shown the whole truth, Christopher retorted, his tone dangerously sharp now. But you wouldn't know that because you haven't actually watched the work you're criticizing. You've just read whatever talking points someone gave you to make yourself look socially conscious. The accusation detonated between them like a bomb. Kelly's face went white, then flushed red. How dare you suggest I don't know what I'm talking about? How dare you imply that my concerns about social justice are just talking points? Then prove me wrong, Christopher challenged. Tell me about specific episodes where you think we got it wrong. Tell me about storylines you believe were harmful. Give me something concrete, anything besides these vague accusations. Kelly opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling. The silence stretched on as the studio audience held its breath, watching the tension build. Finally, she said, I don't need to prove anything to you. The criticism speaks for itself. The impact speaks for itself. The criticism speaks for itself? Christopher repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You can't even name one specific example of the harm you're accusing me of causing. You're just repeating generic talking points about police procedurals without any real understanding of what you're talking about. I understand enough, Kelly said defensively. I understand that representation matters, that when the same stories are told over and over, it shapes how people see the world. And I understand, Christopher interrupted sharply, that when talk show hosts try to play political commentator without doing their homework, it's embarrassing for everyone involved. The personal jab hit hard. Kelly's composure shattered completely. Get out, she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. Get out of my studio right now. Gladly, Christopher said, already walking toward the edge of the set. This has been one of the most unprofessional interviews I've ever experienced. Unprofessional? Kelly's voice followed him, rising in fury. Christopher, you're the one being unprofessional. You're the one who can't handle hard questions about your work. Christopher stopped and turned back toward her, his expression cold and final. Kelly, I can handle hard questions. What I can't handle is being ambushed by someone more interested in virtue signaling than understanding the work they're criticizing. Don't you dare accuse me of virtue signaling, Kelly shot back, her voice matching his in intensity. Don't you dare suggest I don't care about these issues. Then maybe next time, Christopher said, voice cutting through the air like a blade. Do your homework before you try to tear down someone's life's work. With that, he turned and walked off the set. The studio fell into stunned silence. Some audience members applauded, others booed, while most just sat frozen in disbelief. Kelly stood alone, her face flushed and her hands trembling slightly. "We'll be right back," she said to the cameras, her voice barely steady. But everyone knew there was no real coming back from this. The interview hadn't ended with the usual laughter or polite applause. It had imploded, becoming one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history. Producers scrambled to cut to commercial as Christopher disappeared through the studio doors, leaving chaos in his wake. The world of daytime TV, carefully polished and controlled, had been shattered by a raw, unscripted clash between two powerful personalities who saw art, politics, and responsibility in fundamentally different ways. As the cameras stopped rolling, the audience buzzed with confusion and awe. They had come expecting Kelly's trademark warmth and charm, but instead, they had witnessed something unprecedented, something that would be dissected for years to come. What began as a simple promotional interview had turned into a cultural flashpoint, a debate over art, justice, and truth itself. Both Kelly Clarkson and Christopher Meloni had revealed sides of themselves their fans had never seen before. Neither emerged unscathed. The confrontation would go down as more than a failed interview. It became a symbol of the deep divisions shaping modern culture, a reminder that even the most innocent conversations can ignite into something much larger. As Christopher walked out of that studio, he didn't just leave behind an unfinished interview. He left behind a moment that would define both of their careers in ways neither of them could have foreseen.